Black girl CEO's seat stolen by white passenger. 1 minute later, flight is grounded. It was just another typical day for Maya Johnson, the CEO of a rapidly growing tech company. She had just completed a major deal with an international partner, something that had taken months of negotiation. After weeks of back-to-back meetings, conferences, and presentations, she was finally heading home to get some well-earned rest. Maya was no stranger to hard work and long hours. As a black woman in a high-stakes, male-dominated industry, she had faced plenty of obstacles, but each challenge had only made her more determined. Today, her flight was supposed to be her escape. The seat she was assigned in business class was a little touch of luxury she rarely got to experience, and she couldn't wait to sink into the plush seat, close her eyes, and relax for the flight. As she boarded the plane, Maya felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and today, despite everything going on in her life, she was finally going to take a breath. The business class section was relatively calm, and the flight attendants greeted her with polite smiles. Maya made her way down the aisle, rolling her suitcase behind her. Her seat was near the window, and she was looking forward to the quiet solitude that came with flying above the clouds. But as she approached her row, her heart sank. There, sitting comfortably in her seat, was a middle-aged white man. He was casually flipping through a magazine, completely unaware of Maya's presence. Maya paused for a moment. She wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she couldn't just let someone take her seat either. The seat had been assigned to her for a reason, and it was a small but important luxury she was entitled to after her long journey. Maya took a deep breath and cleared her throat. "Excuse me, sir, I believe you're in my seat," she said politely. The man didn't immediately respond. He kept flipping through his magazine, clearly distracted. Maya repeated herself a little louder this time. "Excuse me, sir, that's my seat." He looked up at her, his face barely registering any surprise. "Oh, really? Sorry about that," he said, his voice nonchalant. "I thought this was mine." He gave a slight chuckle as he slowly started to gather his things. Maya couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting in her seat. It was the tone in which he dismissed her. She had spoken politely, and yet his response felt like he thought it wasn't a big deal, as if it was just some trivial matter not worth his full attention. The man finally stood up and moved to the seat next to her, all the while muttering an apology under his breath. Maya sank into her seat with a sigh, trying to shake off the feeling of irritation that lingered. She had worked so hard to get to this point in her career. All her life, people had underestimated her, dismissed her, and looked over her as though she didn't belong. And here, in this moment, in a place where she had every right to be, that same feeling was creeping back. But Maya had learned long ago not to let these moments get the best of her. She adjusted her seatbelt, plugged in her earphones, and pulled out a book. She would let this moment pass just like all the others. She had bigger things to focus on. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the world outside the window blurred as they lifted into the sky. Maya stared out the window, trying to focus on the feeling of peace she was meant to have. But no matter how much she tried, the interaction with the man stuck with her. She thought about how it would have played out differently if she hadn't spoken up. How she could have just let it go, let him have the seat, and kept the peace. But something inside her didn't want to stay silent anymore. She didn't want to be that woman who just accepted things when they weren't right. As the plane soared higher, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines wash over her. She couldn't help but wonder, though, if things hadn't gone as smoothly as they did, would this incident have led to something bigger? What would happen if her voice was louder next time? But that was a thought for another time. For now, she just wanted to rest. She'd earned it. As Maya settled into her seat, trying to let go of the frustration from the earlier confrontation, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The man who had taken her seat was now sitting across the aisle, his presence a reminder of the small injustice that had occurred. She forced herself to focus on something else, anything else, to distract her mind from the lingering irritation. The flight attendants continued their routine, moving up and down the aisles, serving drinks and snacks, and checking in with passengers. Maya noticed one of them approach the man who had taken her seat, offering him a drink. He smiled and politely accepted it, leaning back in his seat with an air of contentment that made Maya's frustration flare up again. She wanted to ignore him. She really did. But the more she looked at him, the more her mind churned with thoughts of what had just happened. She had been treated as if she were invisible, as if her claim to the seat wasn't worth more than a casual apology. She tried to calm herself, but the feeling of injustice was not something she could easily shake off. The moment was made all the more uncomfortable when the flight attendants began to gather the boarding passes from passengers in the business class section. One of the flight attendants came up to Maya, a smile on her face, but her eyes betrayed the tension in her posture. "I'm terribly sorry about the confusion earlier, ma'am. I trust you're comfortable now?" she asked, her voice polite but strained. Maya nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, thank you. It's fine now." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing over at the man who had taken her seat. Maya followed her gaze, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. It was clear that the situation had unsettled more than just her. The flight attendant's expression softened, but she quickly masked it with her professional demeanor. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know," she said, before moving away to attend to the other passengers. Maya sat back, feeling both grateful for the acknowledgement and a little disappointed. She had hoped for more. After all, this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was a violation of her space, her right to be treated with respect. The fact that the flight attendants hadn't stepped in sooner made her wonder whether her complaint had been taken seriously at all. She stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by below, her mind racing. The flight had been delayed for maintenance earlier, and now it seemed like the events were spiraling into something much larger than she had anticipated. Maya couldn't help but think about the larger implications of what had just happened. It wasn't about the seat, it was about how her presence was so easily dismissed. This wasn't just about her individual experience on the plane. It was about a lifetime of these small moments where her voice, her space, her presence had been minimized or ignored. She thought back to her early years, the many times she had worked tirelessly to prove herself. There had been so many moments where she had felt like she had to work twice as hard to be heard, to be seen. It was exhausting, but she had always pushed through. And now, even in this small moment of being wronged, she felt that old, familiar feeling rising up inside her, the need to fight to make things right, to demand respect. Maya took a deep breath. She had a decision to make. Just as she was about to return to her thoughts, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. I'd like to inform you that we are currently experiencing a minor issue with the cabin's ventilation system. The crew is addressing it and will keep you updated. We anticipate a slight delay, but we're working hard to resolve the matter as quickly as possible." Maya's brow furrowed as she heard the announcement. She was no expert, but she had a feeling this wasn't the real reason for the delay. She had overheard the flight attendants whispering about the situation earlier, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. The tension in the cabin had risen slightly after the seat dispute, and it seemed that the atmosphere was now thick with an unspoken discomfort. As time passed, Maya's attention wandered back to the man who had taken her seat. He was still sitting across the aisle, now chatting with a woman seated beside him. He looked completely at ease, as if nothing had happened. It only served to deepen Maya's feeling of frustration. How was it that he could go about his business without a second thought, while she couldn't even sit in her seat without feeling like an outsider? The flight attendants continued to make their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. But Maya noticed that the crew seemed a little on edge. There were hushed conversations, quick glances exchanged, and the usual smooth service was now slightly interrupted by a sense of unease. She could see the flight attendants trying to maintain their professionalism, but it was clear that the earlier incident had rattled the atmosphere more than they were letting on. Then, just a few minutes after the captain's announcement, another message came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that due to an ongoing security issue, we've been advised to remain on the ground for the time being. We ask that everyone remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while the crew addresses the situation." Maya's stomach sank. Security issue? What did that even mean? She glanced around the cabin, noticing that some passengers were starting to murmur in confusion. Others exchanged worried looks. The once relaxed atmosphere had shifted, and now there was an undercurrent of tension hanging in the air. The man who had taken her seat looked over at Maya again, his eyes narrowing slightly. She caught his gaze and held it for a moment, feeling a flicker of defiance rise within her. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she had the distinct feeling that this was no ordinary flight delay. As the minutes passed, the cabin remained grounded, and the passengers were left to stew in a mixture of confusion and frustration. Maya, now fully awake and alert, couldn't help but feel like the situation had taken a strange turn. What had seemed like a minor inconvenience just moments ago was now spiraling into something far more serious. It was then that the flight attendants began to move through the cabin in a more hurried manner, quietly speaking to each passenger and ensuring everyone was settled. There was an urgency in their movements, and Maya could feel the tension building as the situation slowly unfolded. She leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. Something was happening, something more than just a simple seat dispute. Whatever the cause, the flight was grounded, and her once peaceful journey had been turned upside down. The minutes felt like hours as the plane remained on the tarmac, its engines idling as if they too were waiting for something to happen. The cabin was filled with murmurs, some passengers chatting nervously, while others stared out the windows, trying to make sense of the sudden delay. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on behind the scenes. She glanced around the cabin again, noticing that the flight attendants were moving quickly, speaking in low voices as they passed between rows. They were more alert now, their calm professionalism starting to crack under the pressure of whatever was unfolding. As the cabin settled into an uncomfortable silence, Maya returned her attention to the man who had taken her seat. He had stopped talking to the woman beside him and was now looking at his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maya couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Did he realize how his casual dismissal of her had made her feel? Or had it simply slipped from his mind, replaced by whatever was occupying his attention now? It wasn't just the seat, she reminded herself. It was the way he had treated her, as if she wasn't even worth considering. She wasn't sure why that bothered her so much, but it did. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the flight attendants walked down the aisle, her face tight with worry. She wasn't carrying the usual cart with drinks and snacks, and instead of her usual calm demeanor, her eyes flickered nervously as she passed Maya's row. The attendant quickly glanced at the man who had taken her seat and then back at Maya, as if silently acknowledging the tension. Maya gave a small nod in return, but the exchange didn't offer any answers, only more questions. The flight attendant disappeared behind the curtains that separated the business class from the rest of the plane, and Maya watched her leave, a sense of foreboding growing in her chest. She could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but undeniable. The flight wasn't just delayed. It felt like something larger was at play. The murmurs in the cabin began to pick up as passengers started to share theories about the delay. Some thought it was a mechanical issue, while others speculated that it might be something to do with the weather. But none of the passengers had any real answers, and the lack of information only fueled the growing anxiety. Maya couldn't help but feel like the situation was somehow connected to what had happened earlier. She thought back to the seat dispute. Had it really been just a simple misunderstanding, or was there more to it than she realized? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed that there was a deeper issue at play. Perhaps the man's casual disregard for her, his assumption that he could simply take her seat without consequence, wasn't an isolated incident. Maybe it was a symptom of something bigger, something that Maya had experienced time and again in her career. It was the same sense of entitlement, the same disregard for her as a person. And now, as she sat there, grounded in an airplane, she couldn't help but wonder if this moment was somehow connected to the challenges she had faced her whole life. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, interrupting Maya's thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently awaiting further instructions from ground control. The situation will be addressed shortly. We kindly ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work to resolve this issue. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience." The announcement was calm, but Maya could sense the tension in the captain's voice. This wasn't just a routine delay. Something serious was going on, and whatever it wasn't going to be resolved quickly. Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. She had been through enough delays to know that this wasn't just about a technical issue, it was about something much more complicated. The fact that they were still grounded, with no clear explanation, made her uneasy. She tried to push the feeling down, but it lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. As the minutes stretched on, the man who had taken her seat began to fidget. Maya could see him glance over at the flight attendants, his expression hardening as he seemed to grow impatient with the delay. He muttered something under his breath, and though Maya couldn't catch the words, she could tell he wasn't happy with the situation. His irritation was palpable, and she felt a flicker of resentment rise within her. Why was he so quick to complain about a delay when he had already caused one himself? It was as if his earlier actions had no consequences at all. The thought made her blood boil. But Maya took a deep breath, pushing the frustration aside. She couldn't let him control her emotions. She couldn't let him have that power over her. Instead, she turned her focus inward, trying to find some peace amidst the chaos. She thought about everything she had accomplished to get to this point in her life. She had fought hard to build her career, to earn the respect of her colleagues, and to break through the barriers that so often stood in her way. She wasn't going to let this moment, this small, petty dispute, define her. Her reflection was interrupted by a sudden movement in the aisle. Maya looked up to see the flight attendant who had been speaking with the captain earlier, walking toward her row. This time the attendant wasn't moving quickly. She seemed to be walking with purpose, her face serious. When she reached Maya's seat, she stopped, her gaze flickering over the man who had taken her seat and then back to Maya. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with you for a moment," the attendant said quietly. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the sudden shift in tone made her uneasy. She nodded, following the flight attendant into the galley at the front of the business class section. Once they were out of earshot, the attendant spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, we've had a situation develop on the ground. The authorities have been notified, and there may be more delays while they investigate." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "We need to keep the situation under control. Please remain calm and don't engage with anyone about what's going on." Maya's mind raced as she processed the words. Authorities? Investigate? Her thoughts immediately returned to the man who had taken her seat. Was he involved in whatever was happening? Could this entire situation, this delay, be tied to him? Before she could ask another question, the flight attendant excused herself and hurried back to the front of the plane. Maya stood there for a moment, her thoughts swirling. Something was happening, and it was bigger than she had anticipated. The flight was grounded, but Maya couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning. Maya stood by the galley for a moment, trying to process what the flight attendant had just told her. Authorities had been notified, and there was an investigation happening, but no one had given her any clear explanation about what was going on. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and it only seemed to grow with every passing minute. She returned to her seat, her mind racing. The plane was still on the ground, and the feeling of uncertainty had settled into her chest like a heavy weight. Maya couldn't help but think that the delay wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. Something bigger was happening, and it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that it had something to do with the events that had unfolded earlier. She glanced over at the man who had taken her seat. He was now engaged in a quiet conversation with a passenger across the aisle, but he didn't look quite as comfortable as he had before. His posture was tense, and he kept glancing over at the flight attendants, his brow furrowed in frustration. It was clear that he, too, was beginning to realize that something wasn't right. Maya didn't know what was going on, but a sinking feeling in her gut told her that this situation was no coincidence. She had already overheard the flight attendants whispering about security concerns, and the strange behavior of the man who had taken her seat felt like more than just a casual incident. She couldn't ignore the possibility that this was all connected. The question now was whether she would find out the truth, or if she would just be left in the dark like the other passengers, left to wonder what had caused this delay. The minutes stretched on, and the rest of the passengers began to grow restless. Some of them tried to strike up conversations with the flight attendants, asking questions about the delay, but the attendants were careful with their words, offering only vague answers that left everyone with more questions than they had before. Maya shifted in her seat, trying to find some comfort in the uncomfortable silence. Her mind was still on the earlier incident with the man in her seat. He had been so dismissive, so sure that he could simply take what didn't belong to him. And now here they were, grounded and stuck in a situation that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Maya couldn't help but feel that his actions had somehow led them here. She wasn't sure how, but there was a connection, she was certain of it. The man who had taken her seat was still fidgeting with his phone, occasionally glancing over at the flight attendants. It was as if he knew something, as if he understood the gravity of the situation, but was keeping it to himself. Maya's curiosity got the better of her. She had to know what was going on, and if he knew something, she wasn't going to let him sit there in silence while the rest of them were left to suffer. She stood up and made her way down the aisle, her steps purposeful. The man barely noticed her approach, his eyes focused on the screen of his phone. Maya hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. The man looked up, surprised. For a moment he said nothing. Then he cleared his throat and shook his head, as if trying to shake off the tension. "No idea," he replied, his voice low. "Just got a text saying there's some kind of issue, but nothing more than that. They've been pretty tight-lipped about it." Maya studied him for a moment, watching the way his eyes flickered nervously as he spoke. She had never seen someone look so out of place. His earlier confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something far less certain. It was almost as if he was pretending not to know what was really going on, trying to play it off as just another inconvenience. Maya nodded slowly. "You don't seem like you're too concerned about this delay." He shrugged, but his unease was hard to hide. "It's not like I can do anything about it. They'll figure it out eventually, right?" He glanced at the flight attendants again, his gaze lingering as if he was trying to read their faces. "I just want to get this over with." Maya could tell he was nervous. He wasn't fooling anyone, least of all her. There was something about the way he was acting that didn't add up. He'd been the one to start this whole mess by sitting in her seat, but now, as the situation escalated, he was acting like he had nothing to do with it. Maya couldn't help but wonder if he was more involved than he was letting on. Just as she was about to press him for more answers, the flight attendants moved through the cabin again, but this time they weren't offering snacks or drinks. They were speaking to each passenger in hushed tones, asking them to remain in their seats with their seatbelts fastened. There was a new urgency in their movements, and it made Maya's heart race. The tension in the cabin was building, and Maya could feel the sense of something bigger, something far more serious, on the horizon. The flight attendants were starting to look worried, and it was clear that whatever had caused the delay wasn't something they had anticipated. Maya returned to her seat, feeling more confused than ever. She glanced out the window, but the view of the tarmac was no longer calming. Instead, it made her feel trapped, as if the world outside was moving while they were stuck, waiting for answers that might never come. The sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. She had always been someone who fought for what she believed in, someone who refused to back down in the face of adversity. But right now, she felt completely at the mercy of whatever was going on. Minutes turned to hours, and still, the plane remained grounded. Every announcement from the captain seemed more cryptic than the last, and the flight attendants continued to move through the cabin with a sense of urgency, but without offering any concrete answers. Maya's mind kept drifting back to the man who had taken her seat. He seemed oddly calm, considering the growing uncertainty in the air. She couldn't help but feel that he was hiding something, something that might explain why this flight had been grounded. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that the situation on the ground has become more complicated. Due to security concerns, we are currently being held on the runway for further investigation. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice. We understand this delay is frustrating, but we appreciate your cooperation." Maya's heart sank. Security concerns? What did that even mean? Was there more to the situation than she had realized? The growing sense of unease in the cabin was now impossible to ignore. Something was happening, something bigger than just a delayed flight, and Maya couldn't help but feel that the answer was closer than she thought. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing moment, the unease in the cabin seemed to grow. Maya's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had. Authorities had been called. There was an investigation underway, security concerns. The vague details were enough to stir up her imagination, but they left her with more questions than answers. What was really happening? Was this something she could just ignore, or was she somehow caught up in a larger situation? She glanced around the cabin, trying to gauge the reactions of the other passengers. Some were staring out the windows, others were nervously tapping on their phones, and a few had even gotten up to stretch their legs, despite the flight attendants repeatedly asking everyone to remain seated. But it was clear that no one had any real answers. The flight attendants, too, seemed increasingly uneasy. They had been circling the cabin, whispering to each other, and their usual calm demeanor was now replaced by a subtle tension. Maya's thoughts turned back to the man who had taken her seat. For a moment, she had almost forgotten about him, but now he was back on her mind. He hadn't been acting like someone who was just a clueless passenger. There was something in the way he had avoided eye contact, the way he had seemed too calm about the whole situation, that made her suspicious. The delay wasn't just some inconvenience to him, it was as though he had expected it. Maya's suspicion grew. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about his behavior that didn't sit right. Was he connected to whatever was going on? She tried to stay calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing the beginning of something much bigger. She glanced over at him again. He was still on his phone, but now his face was more tense than before. He was tapping at the screen rapidly, his fingers moving quickly, his eyes darting back and forth across the screen. She was about to stand up and approach him again when the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your continued patience. The situation is still being assessed, and we are working with ground control and security to resolve the matter. We will update you as soon as possible. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The captain's voice, calm and composed, did little to ease the growing sense of discomfort in the cabin. The announcement was, once again, vague. No real information was being shared, and passengers were left in the dark, fidgeting with their phones, exchanging whispered speculations, and growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of clarity. Maya could feel the rising tension around her, and it mirrored the tension building within her. What was going on? Was this just a mechanical issue, or was there something more sinister at play? She couldn't help but notice how calm the man who had taken her seat still seemed. He was now on a call, his voice low, but Maya could hear the distinct tone of urgency in his words. He was speaking quickly, and although his words were inaudible from where she sat, there was no mistaking the sense of quiet tension in his voice. Something was definitely off. Maya's instincts told her that he knew more than he was letting on, and for the first time, she felt a small flicker of doubt. Could he have been involved in causing the security concern that was now keeping them grounded? Her thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendants began to walk down the aisle again. This time, however, they were not offering drinks or snacks. They were taking note of the passengers, speaking in hushed tones, making sure everyone was still seated. There was a noticeable sense of urgency in their movements. They weren't just checking on the passengers, they were scanning the cabin, observing everyone carefully. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. The flight attendants had always been polite, efficient, and calm, but now their demeanor had changed. There was a quiet, subtle tension in the way they moved, like they were preparing for something big. One of the flight attendants, who had been speaking to the passengers earlier, approached Maya's row again. She stood for a moment, looking at Maya as if weighing whether or not to speak. Maya looked up at her heart pounding in her chest. The attendant's face was a mask of professionalism, but her eyes betrayed the tension that was barely contained beneath the surface. "We need to keep this quiet," the attendant said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more going on than we've told you. Please just stay calm and remain seated. We'll keep you updated as soon as we can." The flight attendant turned and quickly moved away before Maya could ask any questions. The cryptic warning only added to the tension. There was no mistaking it now, something serious was happening. But what? And why weren't they telling the passengers more? Maya tried to shake the sense of unease that had taken over her. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were starting to come together in a way that didn't feel right. The man who had taken her seat was acting strange. He seemed too calm, too collected. And now, with the flight grounded, the authorities involved, and the flight attendants on edge, Maya couldn't help but wonder if he was the key to understanding what was going on. She glanced over at him once more. He was still on the phone, but his face was now flushed with tension. There was no way to know for sure what was happening, but Maya felt an undeniable sense of urgency. She couldn't sit idly by anymore. She had to find out what was going on. As she stood up, her mind made up. The plane suddenly jolted. The motion was slight but noticeable, and it caught everyone off guard. A few gasps rang out from the other passengers as the plane seemed to lurch forward, as though it were about to take off again. But then, just as quickly, the plane settled back into its position on the runway, and an uneasy silence fell over the cabin. The sudden jolt had only added to the mystery. What was happening? Why was the plane still grounded? Maya's heart raced as she looked around the cabin once more. The tension was palpable, and now it seemed to be building to a breaking point. The uncertainty was wearing on everyone. The air in the cabin felt thick with questions, with worry, and with the nagging sense that the answers were just out of reach. And then, as if to heighten the confusion even further, the man who had taken her seat hung up the phone. He stood up abruptly, looking around the cabin. His eyes locked with Maya's for a brief moment before he turned and walked toward the front of the plane, heading for the galley. Maya's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment. Whatever had been happening was now coming to a head. She couldn't let him slip away without knowing more. She had to get to the bottom of this. With a determined step, Maya followed him. The plane finally began to move again, but the feeling inside the cabin had changed. The engines hummed, the safety message played, and people adjusted their seatbelts, yet the moment from earlier stayed heavy in the air. The young CEO sat quietly by the window looking straight ahead. She did not smile or frown. She simply breathed, steady and calm, as she always did when things became difficult. Around her, other passengers avoided eye contact at first. Some stared at their phones. Others looked out the window as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside their minds, many were replaying the scene. They had seen how quickly doubt appeared. They had seen how confidence turned into challenge, and how fairness had to be proven instead of assumed. A woman across the aisle glanced over and gave a small, respectful nod. It was not loud or dramatic, but it meant something. A man a few rows back leaned toward his travel companion and whispered that he could not believe what he had just seen. Someone else quietly shook their head. The flight was moving forward, but so were the thoughts of the people on board. The CEO rested her hands in her lap. Her phone buzzed with emails she had missed during the delay. Messages from her assistant, her board, and her family appeared one after another. She did not open them right away. Right now, she needed a moment to herself. She had learned over the years that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply staying present and refusing to shrink. She thought back to the beginning of her journey. She remembered being a young girl with big ideas and little support. She remembered classrooms where she was underestimated, meetings where she was ignored, and moments when she was told to wait her turn. Each time, she had chosen to keep going. Each time, she had chosen excellence over anger. That choice had brought her here to this seat on this flight, heading toward another important chapter of her life. The flight attendant passed by and paused for a moment. In a soft voice, she apologized again for the delay and thanked the CEO for her patience. The apology felt sincere. The CEO nodded and said it was okay. She knew the situation was larger than one person. It was about habits, assumptions, and the stories people carried without questioning them. As the plane lifted into the sky, the city below grew smaller. The tension slowly loosened. People settled into their routines. Drinks were served. Laptops were opened. But something had shifted. The cabin was quieter, more thoughtful. A few rows ahead, the passenger who had caused the issue sat silently. He did not look around. He did not speak. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone. He stared straight ahead, faced with the reality of his mistake. No one mocked him. No one celebrated. The lesson did not need noise. It was already clear. The CEO finally opened her phone and read her messages. One from her assistant asked if she was okay. She typed a short reply, "All good, on the way." That was all she needed to say. She did not want sympathy. She wanted progress. As the hours passed, the incident became a quiet story shared in whispers. Some passengers typed notes on their phones, posting reflections without names or accusations. Others simply thought about how easily they had judged without facts. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, it was eye-opening. The CEO used the time to prepare for her meeting. She reviewed slides, adjusted notes, and practiced key points in her head. Her focus returned to what mattered most. She had built her company with discipline, vision, and belief. One moment on a flight would not define her. What defined her was how she moved forward. When the plane began its descent, sunlight filled the cabin. The mood felt lighter now, but more aware. People gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. As they stood in the aisle, a few passengers quietly thanked the CEO for how she handled herself. They did not say much, just a few kind words. She accepted them with grace. As she stepped off the plane, she felt a sense of clarity. The world was changing, but slowly. Moments like this mattered because they revealed truths people often ignored. They showed how easily respect could be withheld and how powerful calm dignity could be. Later that day, the CEO walked into her meeting with confidence. She spoke clearly. She answered questions with ease. The investors listened. They saw her leadership, her intelligence, and her vision. The meeting ended successfully. Another door opened. Days later, the story surfaced online, shared by someone who had been on the flight. It did not use names. It did not exaggerate. It simply described what happened and how it felt to witness it. The post spread quickly. People commented with their own experiences, their own reflections, their own promises to do better. The CEO read the post late one evening. She did not comment. She did not seek attention. But she understood the power of the moment. Sometimes, change begins not with shouting, but with witnessing truth in silence. She hoped that the next time someone boarded a plane, entered a meeting, or took a seat they had earned, fewer questions would be asked based on appearance alone. She hoped that respect would become the default, not something that had to be proven. As she closed her laptop and looked out at the city lights, she felt proud, not just of herself, but of the path she had chosen. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew who she was, and no one could take that seat from her.